today. I hope you can hear me well, see me. Um, this is our Paula Kantor seminar series, the second last meeting that we are having in this year. And you probably all have seen from the invitation that was, I think, circulated last week. Today we have external guests. Our colleagues from IFPRI are presenting, and we're very glad to have them here. And thank you once again to Jessica, Chibuso, and Hawa for being here with us. And they will be presenting work on a topic that, within, at least to my knowledge and my understanding, a topic that within the JC space tends to be a bit understudied, undersearched, or only recently is gaining more prominence, which is youth. So we will be hearing about gender and youth in agricultural value chains, in-depth look at how restrictive gender norms manifest, and the potential of financial inclusion in northern Nigeria. So Jessica Haggard, she's a senior research fellow at IFPRI's Poverty, Gender and Inclusion Division. She will be presenting along with Chibuso Nwagboso. I hope I didn't mess that up too much. A research analyst with development strategies and governance at IFPRI, and also Hawa Kabir, who works as a consultant with IFPRI. So thanks again for being with us. And I would just like to hand it over to you guys, and we're looking very much forward to your presentation. Thank you, Jessica. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. It's when I talked to Hawa and Shibuzo about doing this presentation with me and presenting some of their work that's coming out of this. One of the first things that Hawa told me, she was like, "Oh, I think I met that woman, Paula Kantor." And so it was a nice sort of like full circle moment that she participated in some. She can talk about it briefly, but she participated in some capacity sharing activities that and some training activities that Paula led a very long time ago. But it was important in her own career, in Hawa's own career. So thank you all for having us. This has been a huge team effort, not just with Hawa and Chibuzo, but with several other researchers at IFPRI. And I'm just going to start us off with sort of the background overall on this project. And then we're going to dive in deep on the results from and findings from two areas that where Howell and Chibuzo have been leading the analysis and write up. So you'll get to hear a lot more from them than from me. Um, so so overall, I mean, I think that this audience sort of knows these general background motivation things, but large global concerns about youth unemployment and youth underemployment. And then youth in rural areas in particular face disproportionate challenges due to remoteness, limited infrastructure, high poverty rates, et cetera. Um, and then and then productive employment in terms of employment and decent in terms of quality. Those sorts of opportunities for both young men and young women in rural areas often remain really limited. And while agriculture is positioned to absorb a lot of rural youth, it often isn't able to provide like these decent and meaningful work opportunities that youth are seeking. Um, so, um, and then so the youth population in Africa is, of course, quite large relative to the rest of the population. And at this point, it's positioned if there are job opportunities for youth, it's well positioned to contribute to the development and transformation of the agricultural sector. So overall, it's just a big project description. This falls under some work by IFPRI supported by the MasterCard Foundation under a 5-year partnership titled Strengthening Food Systems to Promote Increased Value Chain Employment Opportunities for Youth. And this initiative is positioned to conduct critical research to inform the strengthening of local food systems and make them more efficient and sustainable, inclusive for youth. There are research activities across all 8 of these countries listed, the countries where we have the most substantial agendas linking gender and youth are Kenya, Nigeria, and Rwanda. This work is part of the MasterCard Foundation's Young Africa Work Strategy, which aims to create dignified and fulfilling work for 30 million young people in Africa, with a specific focus on, I think it's 70 or 75% of those jobs being for young women specifically. Um, so I mentioned this as like a large overarching project. We're really focusing on our qualitative formative research here today in Nigeria, but there are both qualitative and quantitative components. We've also recently completed a large youth survey in northern Nigeria, and it's happening soon in Kenya and Rwanda. So this is just sort of one piece of a pretty broad package of work here. So today's focus specifically is on this qualitative formative work to gain a better understanding of the barriers and opportunities faced by young women and young men in agricultural value chains. And then specific to that, there's an in-depth focus in terms of who we sampled and the commodities we talked about on millet, sorghum, soybean, groundnut, and horticulture products. Sorry, no wheat or maize, but sorghum and millet are right up there. So our overarching research questions, we have 5 overarching research questions on this project. The 2 that I've bolded are some of those are where Hawa and Chibuza are going to present findings from today. Are like subcomponents from those 2 questions. So we're looking at how young women and young men are currently participating in these priority commodities for northern Nigeria. We're looking at how young women and young men define and experience dignified and fulfilling work, and part of that then is understanding like what can make agricultural jobs more dignified and more fulfilling for youth. So we're also looking at how gender norms in particular might limit the involvement of young women and young men in processing and marketing activities, and then how these gender norms can either be addressed or accommodated or transformed. So and then we're also looking at obstacles more broadly, and then finally an in-depth look at financial services and understanding what young men and young women are currently using and what obstacles they face to accessing capital, safeguarding resources in order to be able to participate fully in agricultural value chains. So a bit of a background on just the methods here. This, as I mentioned, formative, qualitative research. Topically, it's like we're looking at experiences with jobs, aspirations and characteristics of ideal work, gender roles and norms in agricultural value chains, the barriers and facilitators to employment in agricultural processing and marketing. And then we collected data through a wide range of interviews and focus group discussions. They included interviews and focus discussions with young women and young men working in agriculture, including processing and marketing in other sectors, youth who were working in who are not working in those areas as well were participated. We looked at key actors in agricultural value chains, as well as non-youth community leaders. And then in northern Nigeria in particular, we had a focus on IDPs, on internally displaced persons, to better understand what their experience is. And then just a note on that sampling, those people were generally the IDPs that participated in our study were generally, or they were integrated into communities where the general landscape communities, and not like specific to camps or anything. So our sample characteristics overall, we specifically looked at Adamawa, Borno, Kano, Sokoto, and Yobe states in northern Nigeria. And then over here and in general for the analysis, we did a thematic analysis using MaxQDA software with inductive and deductive coding. But we all know that's sort of, just the facilitator for like in-depth reading and in-depth and in-depth discussions and talking about all the different themes that are coming out of it. So and on the right hand side here, just like some quick summaries of the different sample sizes. We had these key informant interviews specifically are across like a wide range of individuals to get the like the full holistic viewpoint on experiences for youth in agriculture, experiences with young men and young women themselves, with careful sex disaggregated selection and organization of these focus groups. And I'm going to turn things over to Hawa and to talk about how gender norms affect participation in agri-food systems. And Hawa Hawa can just let me know. You can let me know when we want me to switch between the slides.
All right. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Hawa. And like Jessica said, I was really excited to be part of this. When she mentioned Paula Kantor, I was like, so I had to sort of, verify, and it was Paula. So I was opportune to have been trained by Paula for a few days in Nigeria for an FCDO project. Looking at gender and market systems development. So thank you. So today I will be taking us through how gender norms affect participation in the agri-food systems for young women and young men in northern Nigeria. Next slide, please. Yes, so as a general overview, in Nigeria, culture and religion are a very significant part of the society. And Nigeria has over 250 ethnic groups, each with its own beliefs, its culture and languages. And some of these cultural norms usually lead to discriminatory practices that hinder participation, access to resources, financial autonomy, agency for especially women within the agricultural food systems. And though women have a large contribution to agriculture, in some literature, men agree that women do have a place in agriculture, but they disagree about the value of the contributions of women. But then coming down specifically to youth, we found very little existing evidence that examines the sort of the impact of these dynamics of these norms for young women and young men within the agri-food systems especially. And so we felt the understanding of socio-cultural norms was very important to help determine what points of entry, what the points of entry are for, proper, sustainable intervention for young women and young men. Next slide, please. So I think Jessica has kind of gone through some of this, but I'll still give it a go. So our main research objective was to examine social cultural norms that facilitate or constrain the participation of youth within agricultural value chains, looking through the perspective of youth themselves, young men and young women, and as well as older persons. And our key research questions were we tried to identify what the social norms were that limit the involvement of young women and young men in processing, marketing, and of course, production activities, agricultural, and how these norms can be either addressed or accommodated. Next slide, please. So these are just a few concepts. I'm sure many are already familiar with these, but really gender norms are the societal expectations for what is appropriate versus what is inappropriate for, women and men to do within a society. And this shapes the gender roles, which are actions that men and women typically do in accordance with these gender norms. And the meta norms are usually the overarching gender norms, which if violated could lead to sanctioning, and sanctions are usually enforced when these norms are violated. Next slide, please. Okay. So we are going to talk through four identified social cultural norms, but we do have other norms that we've identified. We are working on developing a journal that should have a more comprehensive overview of all the overlapping and intersecting norms. So the first norm, husbands have religious rights to control their wives' mobility. And this is a norm of religious origin, and it seeks to prevent inappropriate mixing between women and men. And so what usually happens is that women are expected to seek for permission from husbands before they can go to the markets. And it isn't just markets, but women have to make sure that they ask for permission and let their husbands know where they will be, who they will see, and what the nature of business is. So usually husbands have a tendency to limit their wives' freedom in visiting markets because markets are usually men dominated. And so they don't want their wives mixing with other men. And usually this then leads to women relying on intermediaries, including children, for any market purchases that they may want and also for sales of their products. And for impact, this usually, because women are sort of sheltered away from markets, it provides less opportunity for developing any negotiation skills, learning about any new market information and what have you. And usually sales are limited to just neighborhood sales. And this leads to low volumes of sales because they're not, they can't benefit from, a wider market range of customers. And it also means that more children are being made to hawk because to gain access, sort of expand their market, women would typically send children out into the neighborhood and to the market spaces to sell more goods. Next slide, please. The second norm is that parents are wary of income earning for unmarried young women. And the thinking around here is that parents feel that if young women as before marriage engage in some form of income generation, the likelihood of losing suitors would be high because men would see them as sort of independent financially and not likely to be submissive in a marriage. So there's a huge importance placed by parents on the perception of others and how they judge them. And they usually don't want to be judged as bringing up their daughters in a morally wrongful manner. Some of the impact of this is that then young women sort of lack support from parents, from the community itself, and other support systems. And for those young women who actually do participate in some form of trade, they face judgmental attitudes by the community. And usually, because many of young women are sheltered, they cannot develop the necessary skills that would aid them in generating any form of income, and then would have no savings or be unable to save. This is a different picture for young men looking at the right-hand side, who usually are just seen as future breadwinners. So any economic opportunity is usually young men are sort of pushed towards that. And right from childhood, most young men are taught on farming and marketing by their fathers. So usually they accompany their fathers to the farm. So in some ways they pick up certain skills and also to the marketplaces. Next slide, please. The third norm is it is unseemly for women to farm on open fields. And the thinking behind this is that there's a need to safeguard women's dignity and protect from sexual harassment or abuse by men within the farming spaces. And so what this leads to is what normally happens then is women then have to provide for the married young woman They have to provide funds to husbands or other male relatives to farm on their behalf. And so also the unmarried young woman to other male relatives to farm on their behalf. And usually if where women are found farming, it's limited to very small patches of plots within the household or sometimes around the homes, and mostly gardens for horticultural products, not the cash crops. And unmarried young women that actually provide labor on farms are also restricted to only providing labor on farms where the crops do not grow to a very tall height. So usually low height crops where they can be visible while they're working for everyone to see. And the impact of this is that, for instance, for those who provide funds to husbands and other male relatives, there's limited control over how their resources are used at the end of the day, and the likelihood of being swindled or cheated is quite high. The harvest they receive at the end of the day could be very poor, it could be very low volume, but they still have no control over what they receive since they don't do it themselves. And there's also a lack of privacy in earnings and savings. For instance, if a young woman, a married young woman, for instance, was to get some money that her father had given her and probably hadn't told her husband, but then she wants to farm, and now she has to pass that money to her husband. Husband has to know that she has this money. And when it comes to harvest, whatever she gets back, the husband is totally aware of what she gets back. And so there's complete lack of privacy in terms of how they earn. And for those young women who provide farm labor services, there's restriction in the choices that they can make in terms of farm labor jobs. Next slide, please. Our last norm is young women should engage in home-based enterprises. And the thinking around this is that it can be done within the homes, which means they're shielded away from any male attention and any inappropriate mixing. It also keeps young women closer to, certain functions such as childcare and household chores. For young men, this norm also kind of affected young men in this regard. And most young men who have an interest in doing some of the processing that young women would do typically in the home are sort of ridiculed. But there is an exception. If young men process but use machinery-based type processing, then that is acceptable. So young men usually, because they sort of can't process themselves, they collect the goods from young women, the finished goods, such as maybe groundnut oil, for instance, and help to sell in the markets. In terms of impact for young women, naturally, if, they're sort of cooped up and, have to carry out their enterprises within the homes, they have very limited selling channels. I think earlier it sort of also is related to another norm where we said they're limited to neighborhood purchases. So they have lower customer bases, lower returns, and when they're lower returns, that means any aspirations they may have to diversify their trade would be impossible. And this means that more and more children are now being made to hawk. And also, young women have a tendency to incur losses when men customers, particularly within markets and neighborhoods, refuse to pay hawkers. So young women's products are usually cooked goods and maybe snacks and some other spices and what have you. And so men don't take their enterprises very seriously, and so sometimes they will just eat some of this food and refuse to pay. This particular impact is more of a positive impact, and the fact that young men have not evaded the processing, the household work processing space could prevent displacement for young women. And for young men, for impact, they, of course, because now they can do home-based enterprise, they do have a missed opportunity for alternative income sources, and they also do benefit from margins that they put on the goods that they sell for young women. Oops. Okay, next slide, please. So there are different there are negative and positive sanctions for norm violation. And for some of the young women who do carry out marketing and processing activities, usually sometimes they're met with disapproving gazes. Sometimes they're gossiped about. In some cases, they're mocked and ridiculed. And even in instances of young men, they also could face mocking and ridiculing, especially pertaining any enterprise that they might do within the household. And there's a lot of ostracization by community leaders, particularly parents, even siblings, especially male siblings, on, for them not to engage in trade and what have you. And sometimes there are some disputes that happen within the marital home with husbands. Sometimes, for instance, the use of hawkers to sell is a problem that usually husbands like to prevent from happening. But, women use it sort of as a coping mechanism to make more money. And in some cases, this can lead to separation or even divorce. But there are positive sanctions. For instance, the mother-daughter trade. In this type of trade, the mother kind of shields the young woman, the unmarried young woman, from the society by, oops, it's gone, from the society by having a joint type of sort of business with her, with the daughter. So she would give the daughter, for instance, maybe a little capital and say, okay, but we will work together. And so in that respect, the daughter is sort of benefiting from the skills and also the savings that her mother is keeping for her. There are instances where young men also try to shield their mothers and their sisters from community ostracization, and so they collect the products, some of the products that young women may produce, and they help them to sell within the market spaces where they are allowed to be. The instances where community leaders intervene, particularly to do with marital disputes. Young women usually can escalate to community leaders and ensure that they're heard and some kind of resolution taken. And then there are also community meetings. In these youth community meetings, leaders like to call the youth. These are most often male youth, but we have seen quite a number also of young women that the leaders address, and sometimes, they sort of use these meetings to address certain concerns and also hear what the youth have to say pertaining what concerns them and what have you. Next slide, please. So who can get away with norm violation? The first is internally displaced women. So this is because they're seen, they have like an outsider status within these communities, since they're sort of internally displaced, and there's hope that one day they will go back home. So some of these norms may not typically apply to them. And then there's also the reality based on harsher living conditions. Usually IDPs, both young men, young women, and older ones, sometimes they find like homes. If they have relatives, they're with relatives. Some are in the camps. We didn't touch anybody in the camp, but we did focus on the ones that were not in camps. But in many cases, many live within the thicket of forests, making, sort of makeshift houses. And so very harsh living conditions. And so the community realizes that they do have a need for multiple income providers, and young women, all of them also form part of the providers. Then we have young women who have with approval, with parents and husbands' approvals. So parents for unmarried young women have the highest authority on young women, and husbands also have the highest authority on wives. And if they are happy to let them participate within any part of the value chain, then nobody else can sort of top that. Also, women from other religions and tribes, from other regions. So most of the communities we worked in were Muslim communities. And so people that were not Muslims, these laws did not typically apply to them. So they just saw them as almost outsider status. Yeah, okay, so we're good with it. And then we have the husbands or any male relatives. Okay, without any male relatives. And these have, sort of the right to violate norms. It's less a problem for the community because they see them as not likely to attract men anyways. Many of them are seen as very poor and not possessing of funds to be able to hire labor as some of other young men would through their male relatives. And then there's a lot of empathy from the community. So this is sort of accommodated. Next slide, please. So looking at all of these, some of our recommendations were a systematized cottage industry approach for young women, where they sort of come together in a coordinated effort for let's say maybe a production and aggregation hub. And they can leverage on the different skills they have and also the different levels of autonomy that each have to put together a good hub for production and aggregation and marketing. Of course, this will need certain intervention, sort of like provision of certain equipment and even offtake markets. But yeah. So the next one, designated market spaces for traders. This was an interesting one because it was a recommendation that came from young men themselves. And so we were quite excited, and we thought there was an inkling of, some sort of feasibility in there if they were to actually mention that it was the possibility of women having designated market spaces. But in the first instance, already young women are hawking, and usually you see them at the sides of sitting down on the floors at the sides of the markets. So this may not be such an impossibility. Then we also suggest that a bit of dialogue happen at household and community levels. These will be more like sensitization, sort of conscientization activities where men are made to understand the reality. And I think researchers like this, I don't think some of these communities get the chance to actually see the actual picture, like the big picture. So, a lot of things could be showcased in these types of meetings where, especially the realities of women, where what is supposed to happen and what is differs. In many cases, men are seen as the breadwinners and what have you. And so, women don't need to have any funds because, they don't sort of have any sort of financial responsibility. But the reality says differently because women are paying for school fees, women are buying food, women are paying for hospital bills. So there's a great need to sort of look at these issues. And also stakeholder and policy makers and religious leaders, traditional institutions, and other experts. There's need to come and look at some of these issues, especially where norms are passed off as religious principles and people are guilted. There's a lot of misinterpretations and a lack of knowledge, sometimes even religious knowledge, which leads to some of the repurposing of these norms. and how subjective they end up becoming. So I think it is very useful to have these conversations. I know that there have been some traditional and religious leaders that have sort of spoken up on women's issues and the need to safeguard women, especially within marriage. And from maybe just two examples of what we've seen is now there's a bit more of premarital counseling, which should be sort of our third, the sort of dialogue coming together, and ironing out the rights of women over men and vice versa. And also we've seen where now men are made to sign contracts. So if you say that she's going to work, she's going to school, she's going to this and that, you have a document that is legally binding and religiously binding as well. So these are some of the things that would be very good to have this sort of ripple effect and, ensuring that some of these other things happen based on policy changes. So that's the end of my presentation. I will pass it on off to Chibuzo. Chibuzo, please take over. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
All right, thank you, Hawa. Thank you, Jessica. So I will be presenting on exploring gendered solutions to promote financial inclusion in agricultural value chains, which was I think the fifth objective from our broad study. So a general overview. Gaps in financial access has created a double exclusion where women and youth face barriers in agriculture and in society. For instance, the barriers limit their ability to own assets and even on the other hand, also weaken their credit histories. And so where we conducted this study, Northern Nigeria has the highest exclusion rates, that's financial exclusion rates, with 38% of adults in the Northeast and 47% in the Northwest lacking formal financial access. And this is made worse by conflict and insecurity, which has further damaged financial systems in the region and also disrupted agricultural livelihoods. And so improved financial inclusion increases economic autonomy, especially for women. And Jessica has already provided the methodology for the study, but we took a step further to draw on Christian's intersectionality theory and not institutional analysis to explain how different identities shape access for financial inclusion. Next slide, please. So we started by looking at how young men's and young women's capital needs and use of capital differs. So for young women, they mostly engage in processing activities, that's processing of grains. And there were also some young women that engaged in trading of horticultural goods. And so their capital needs were mostly equipment financing for these activities or financial support for acquiring storage facilities. Men, on the other hand, tended towards trading of grains. So their capital needs were mostly purchasing, that's capital for their trading activities, for renting shops, or for acquiring storage facilities. We also looked at what youth borrow. And we found that young women are more cautious borrowers. They would rather borrow in smaller amounts compared to men. And they mostly did this to protect against losses, which unfortunately limits their ability to scale operations or to engage in larger business ventures, unlike young men who are higher risk takers and will borrow more, and it would help them to expand their businesses. Next slide. Thank you. Then we looked at how youth use financial services, that's the current practices, majorly in savings, in borrowing, and payments. So in terms of savings, we found that more young men were likely to own bank accounts, while women tended towards more informal methods, such as the collective savings schemes, saving with their husbands in their husbands' bank accounts or using savings boxes at home. And then in terms of borrowing, both young men and young women preferred to borrow from relatives than to go to financial institutions. However, a larger network. Men have a larger network of people that they could borrow from, unlike women who have a smaller network and would even borrow or in-kind loans in a sense, so grains, inputs, and so on. And then in terms of payment, we found that both young men and young women prefer cash payments. There's an overwhelming preference for cash payments. However, men were more likely to use digital payments, such as the point of sale services, mobile transfers, and the unstructured supplementary service data, which is gaining popularity in this area, considering that banks are far away from the communities. Next slide, please. So we looked at how different payment modalities are associated with different types of barriers, and more specifically looked at cash payments, in-kinds and credits, and digital payments. So cash payments are mostly associated with insecurity, risk of theft, and there was also the issue of elderly people not having bank accounts, which limits alternatives for youth in their agribusinesses. And then the in-kind and credits, which women were more conversant with, also had these issues because sometimes they were at a loss and they also faced the risk of exploitation. And then digital payments, like I said earlier, were more mostly adopted by men. However, they had the most issues such as unreliable networks, high transaction fees, limited smartphone access, and low digital literacy, which was, disproportionately affected more young women majorly. And then gender norms, like Hawa mentioned, restrict women's interaction with male vendors, such as the point of sale service providers, and limit their mobility to banking infrastructures. Next slide. And then we looked at barriers to savings, investments, and loans as well. So for the bank savings, Hawa spoke deeply about the cultural norms. They also were like the most recurring issue in access to financial services because uh, women are required to travel with male companions to distant bank locations, which restricts their access. Also, security constraints, which is on the supply side, limits institutional presence in these rural areas and reduces youth participation. Also, there was a huge we found that most of the existing financial infrastructure are not inclusive for people living with disability. And then for loans, I said earlier that both young men and young women would rather borrow from relatives, and this is because of high collateral interest rates that exclude women and youth because they don't even have assets as well. And then on the supply side again, the financial institutions view smallholder farmers and even youth as high risk borrowers. And there was also another theme that we noticed, which is that the term interest conflicts with Islamic principles. And then there were other issues such as young women. So beyond cultural norms, young women also face lower confidence, so they are not even willing to go to the bank. If a financial service provider mentioned, young women say, what if I can't pay back? They are scared of getting in trouble. So all of these make them lean towards informal loans. However, there are also issues associated with this, such as limited resources, repayment delays, and market risk that could trap them in dependency cycles. Next slide, please. And so, like I mentioned in the beginning, we used the intersectionality theory and the institutional analysis to see how all of these identities affect access. And so this graph here just pretty much illustrates the findings. For instance, we have the cash transactions, the savings boxes, collective savings schemes. They are all informal, but they are inclusive because they are simple, flexible, and so on. And then others such as the mobile money and Sharia compliant microfinance, based on the religion, are formal but inclusive because they expand access through digital tools and the more formal infrastructure. Others, such as loans from family and friends, are and the in-kind credits. They are informal, but they are exclusive because of exploitation, gendered social obligations, and so on. And then lastly, the bank savings, the commercial loans, although they are formal, they are exclusive as it stands because of issues such as the high collateral, documentation issues, literacy, and all that. And then we also summarized who is excluded and how. So looking at it, the broad view is that everyone faces some kind of exclusion, both young women, young men, and it's important to note the IDPs, the internally displaced persons and youths with disabilities, because they are constrained by lack of documentations. That's particularly the IDPs. And then the youths, there aren't facilities, accessible facilities for them in these areas. So all of these barriers exist. Next slide. So lastly, the policy recommendations to help close the gap. We put down about 6 policy recommendations. First of all is financial literacy for women in particular that could be delivered through the collective savings schemes that they already belong to, or the mobile money platforms which young men are conversant with. And then alternative collateral and scaling Sharia compliant products to make young people be more accepting of loans from financial institutions. Then thirdly is digital access for women through trusted female agents and safe digital spaces. The fourth recommendation is on strengthening collectives, particularly through formalizing the corporate or the collective savings schemes which young women and a few young men already belong to. And then lastly is inclusive design, that's creating designs that are inclusive for the displaced population and for people living with disabilities through flexible verification, assistive technologies, and accessible facilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chibusu, Hawa, and also Jessica for your presentation. I would open the floor for any questions, comments. If you have some, please go ahead, unmute yourself or raise your hand, or you can also write your question in the chat if you have. There was some discussion ongoing. Gekem, please go ahead. Gekem Dambo, I don't know if I'm saying it right. Please, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you for the presentation from both presenters. I liked the presentation, but my question is, I mean, with all these initiatives that are happening in Nigeria, not only in Nigeria, but in Africa in general, we still see that most youth are still unemployed, and then at the same time, there is less growth in the agricultural value chains that youth are involved in. And even those that are available, there is less success that are registered. So my question is, where are we missing actually? Where are we missing that despite all these interventions, we see youth being unemployed, youth running to, let's say, European countries for job opportunities. So where are we missing actually? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gekem. That's a very easy question, and I'm handing it over to No, it's of course not. It's the big one, right? Please,
Yeah.
to
So
you and your
Michael,
team.
do you prefer one question, one response, or to collect a variety of questions?
Yeah, whatever you prefer. I don't know how many. If there's other questions, we can take another one. If you want, you can also go in.
I can go ahead, and then
Yeah.
I also hope that Hawa and Chibuzo will chime in with their thoughts on this as well. So yeah, this is a great point. That there have been efforts to address youth unemployment and underemployment in Nigeria and across Africa. I would argue that very few of those have been gender sensitive in any way. So they're that that any attempts to address those attempts to address youth underemployment and unemployment have really only been addressing at most half of the youth population. That's certainly a key component to that. And then of course appropriate for this audience and series that I highlight that response. And of course, there are, this is if we think of like a multi-layered framework of like what's going on in the household and community, and then out at broader layers to policy and investments, et cetera. What we're discussing here is really stuff that's focused on sort of the household and community level. And there are much broader issues that have to be addressed to address youth unemployment more broadly, in terms of engaging with national policymakers, investments in these countries that create jobs, making a better business environment, et cetera. So yeah, not an easy problem to solve. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Any other questions from
I
the
would just
audience?
encourage Chibuzo and Hawa to come off the camera if they can as
sorry,
well.
yeah. Please, yeah,
So
if you want to add
they
anything.
can
Sorry.
not leave me hanging and tortured here while the
Sorry,
questions are
Jessica.
for them.
Please go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. Did you have anything more you wanted to add, Chibuzo, or you wanted
No.
other questions? Okay.
No.
Good. So yeah, I was also thinking, I mean, these are big, the first question went into that direction, right? These are big topics. These are not easy to solve, and this the situation like norms and religion comes into play, and so I was wondering how would you like because there's only I mean, we have done some work in Bangladesh where they have similar set of norms. The woman should be around the homestead, and she's not allowed sometimes to work in the fields, etc. So how do you really change that? I mean, that's like telling me, I like certain things, I have my certain mindset, and that's been like that forever. So what are you, I mean, you've shown your suggestions, and I understand that it's not an easy, but how would you go about like, okay, we need to work. Also, Agnes left her comment there. We can work with the husbands, with the religious leaders, but how, like, what would be strategies for them? How would you engage with them? Like, what would be the messages you would try to convey, and who would do that? I think that still left me a bit puzzled. Um, I agree with all the suggestions you presented, but like I'm wondering how to move this forward now because it's really not easy, right? It's not just handing out something and stuff will change. Maybe you could just
Yeah.
develop on that. Thank you.
I mean, it's not easy, which is why we sort of had the last three recommendations as more of the longer term type things. But it definitely has to come, there definitely has to be policymakers, religious leaders, and traditional institutions that have to come together to sensitize, because most people look up to the traditional system in Nigeria and the religious leaders. So it has to come from them, whether it's, via mass media, it has to start from somewhere. But some of these interventions, we were thinking around just a few discussions, where it doesn't necessarily have to be like putting men on the spot. There could be activities that men sort of like doing, but then in some ways we sort of introduce some of these issues and sort of hear from them why why some of these things, persist. And I think there's also, it'll be useful also for some of the people who sort of aren't for these norms, that sort of do allow young men and young women to participate, like the husbands and some of the other parents, to act sort of as the change agents for some of these discussions, and to sort of showcase why I think my daughter, why I'm sure many people talk about me, but the reason why I have I let my daughters do this and that is because, ABC, like, look at the reality. What would women do if they were, if their husband suddenly died and they were left with children? Look at the conditions of the IDPs. Nigeria has a very huge insecurity problem at the moment. And mostly these armed militants usually target the men. So, these are some of the vulnerabilities that women have. So at community and household level, I think it is more with some of the people who have sort of decided to go against these norms, and sort of the rationale behind it, in a bid to sort of influence thinking. But then policymakers also have to come into play to put some of these things into perspective. But it isn't something that will have happen overnight, for sure. It is a problem, but I think we're happy to see that some, there is some change. For instance, what we found is, what most of the community leaders were telling us was that, oh, now the marriage age has kind of changed. Before it was maybe like 14, 15, but now, parents want the children usually get married in their 20s, because parents want them to school. So those little changes, some of those people who have sort of taken in those changes try to sort of get others to imbibe this. I hope that sort of answers some of that.
No, thank you very much. It was not an easy question. I didn't expect like the solution or anything from you, but it's good. Thank you for sharing your insights. So I think we unfortunately ran out of time already. But thank you so much again to all of the three of you for presenting your work. I think it's very insightful. I think it's also novel, and I'm looking forward to read more about it. I was also wondering like because you have a whole set of countries. I mean, it would also be interesting. Probably you will do that like this cross-country comparisons. How is Nigeria in relation to or relative to the other countries? What are some of the lessons maybe you can also take from one country to another, and so on. So I think it's a very, very interesting project that you have. Congratulations. And I wish you all the best on the way forward. And I hope we can stay in touch. And Maureen already indicated she will be reaching out to you and follow up. So thank you everybody for being with us. Our
Thank
next
you all.
seminar
And
is
I will
already
say
next week.
Thank you, everyone.
we'll have a
Thank you.
report
Bye.
sort of soon, and we'll
Thank
share it
you.
with you.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thanks.
Have a
Bye.
Bye.
great
All right.
day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye
Bye.
bye.